Okay, now we're moving on to attachment. Attachment between a caregiver and their child is one of the most important things in a relationship and for a developing child, even starting from the womb, and especially within the first 3 years of life, and especially within the first 3 to 6 months. Of course, attachment can really affect a human being throughout their whole lives, but we're focusing a lot on caregivers with their younger children. Now, attachment is defined as the relationship bond that involves comfort, pleasure, and safety with a caregiver. Part of that too is the attunement that the caregiver has to the child, because attunement is how a caregiver reads what a child needs, and if they're able to read what a child needs in any situation as fast as they can, they're able to respond and meet that need of a child, which grows the trust and the love in that relationship, which will have a much more positive effect down the line. So moving on to the 4 kinds of attachment. One main kind of attachment is what we consider a healthy attachment, and it is called secure attachment. Secure attachment, just like all the others, is affected by the relationship between the caregiver and the child, essentially from birth, even before, in a lot of ways. Signs that there is a secure attachment between the caregiver and their child come up in many different ways and can be seen, especially when the child starts to go to childcare and to school and starts to explore the world. One symbol of a secure attachment is if a child is having mild stress when leaving a parent, whether to go to childcare or school. It is not so overwhelming that it debilitates them. It's just a mild, maybe crying a little bit, and then they're able to get into the activities. As well, when a parent or a caregiver returns to pick up the child, if they show like a positive reaction and they're happy to see their caregiver, that is another sign of a secure attachment. Another sign of secure attachment is if a kiddo seeks comfort from a parent when they are scared or worried about safety or anything. A lot of people think that coddling a child or like responding to their needs makes a child weak, but in a lot of ways, if a parent is responsive as soon as they can be and as completely as they can be with their child, the child learns to trust them, learns that they can be safe, and they actually are able to go out into the world and explore, and then just come back to their caregiver as more of like a home base. Maybe signs that they need their caregiver in those times of need is not a sign that they are weak or going to have issues later in life. It's actually a sign of healthy attachment. Lastly, a sign of secure attachment is shown when a child prefers their parents over strangers. Of course, you still want that child to be able to meet new people and explore, but at the end of the day, they still show a preference for going with their caregiver back home, or even sometimes playing with them if they're out and about. The other 3 kinds of attachment are more thought of as an unhealthy attachment. When it comes to these kinds, they actually are pretty rare, but can lead to further mental health struggles later in life, have shown to have led to like more tantrums for older children. And so they are important to watch out for and to try and avoid. The first kind of unhealthy attachment is called either ambivalent or resistant attachment, or some people have even called it anxious ambivalent attachment. The ambivalent resistant attachment can be seen through a couple different clues. The first clue is that a child might not seek comfort from their parents, or caregivers. They might not respond as well when they come to pick them up from childcare or school. They might be even a little aggressive or trying to get away from them. Another sign of potentially ambivalent or resistant attachment comes if a child is more clingy and doesn't want to let go of a parent. Unfortunately, a lot of caregivers think that if their child is clinging to them and such, that it means that they just love them so much. And yes, of course, ideally, there is love there. And at the same time, that actually might be a sign that they don't feel the safety with their caregiver in order to be able to go out and explore and meet different people and still come back to them as a home base. Another sign of potentially ambivalent or resistant attachment is if a child is greatly distressed when leaving their caregiver, whether to go to childcare, school, especially if it's like debilitating and it keeps them from getting into play with other children and getting into the rhythm of whatever they're doing at childcare or school. Lastly, a sign of ambivalent or resistant attachment would be if they're more wary of strangers before the age of 9 months old. I should note that a lot of these characteristics of different attachments can also be based off of a child's different temperament or personality. So while these are best practices to look out for or tips to look out for, it doesn't mean that every child is the same. The second form of unhealthy attachment is called avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment can show up in little ways, especially if a child has almost no or little preference for their parents over strangers. So this could be seen if a caregiver goes to pick up their child at childcare or school and they don't want to come to them. They prefer all the time to keep playing. I should say that sometimes it's normal for kiddos to want to continue playing, especially if it's a nice day outside or whatnot when you come to pick them up. But if it continually happens and there's just a large tantrum or a lot of issues picking them up, that might be a sign that there is some avoidant attachment going on. Also, with avoidant attachment, kiddos might avoid their caregivers if they've been separated for a longer period of time. So something to watch out for as well. Lastly, for avoidant attachment, if a child doesn't feel comforted by their parent, they're less likely to seek out their comfort, and that can be a sign that they have that form of attachment. The last form of unhealthy attachment is disorganized attachment. A main characteristic of disorganized attachment is that a child might not know how to react and might be confused or dazed when reacting with caregivers. A large part of this involves them showing different characteristics from either avoidant or ambivalent resistant attachment as well. Another characteristic for having disorganized attachment is that the child feels both comforted and frightened by their caregiver, so they're getting mixed messages, and that can really lead to lack of security. Lastly, when it comes to the 4 kinds of attachment, it's important to recognize that the 3 more unhealthy forms of attachment are more rare and can come from many different circumstances, but that if a caregiver is able to be as responsive to the needs of their child as possible, it is more likely that they will be able to grow a secure and healthy attachment. Some things that have been recognized to cause more unhealthy attachment might be things out of a caregiver's control when it comes to societal barriers, separation from their child, stress in the home or outside. So while there are lots of things that could affect and lead to unhealthy attachments, it's important to recognize that caregivers can work on their best to be as responsive to the needs of their child, and that even if they can't at times, especially at younger ages for the child, that does not mean that they're doomed throughout life, and actually attachment can be affected and grown throughout a person's life. Very key to recognize. Lastly, we're going to go over some of the myths that come with attachment, as well as some tips for continuing to grow attachment with younger kiddos as well as older. First off, for myths. A lot of times, as we mentioned, people think that being responsive to your child and meeting their needs at every point that you can might lead to them being weaker or throwing tantrums when they want something. Luckily, research shows that that is not the case, and that really, if you are responsive and meeting their needs as much as you can, that you're growing the trust with them, and then you're able to put limits when they're at a developmental stage in order to understand more limits in life. It's also important to recognize that kiddos younger than 4 years old don't really understand the connection between doing something and consequences. So while you can put limits on them in certain ways, a lot of it involves distracting and redirecting kiddos younger than that age, because a lot of times they're not trying to do something just to spite you or to make you feel bad. They're being toddlers or younger, and that's very normal developmentally. One thing that a lot of people talk about is cry it out. Should I let them cry it out in the crib and leave them and they'll be fine? Or should I respond to them? We always recommend responding to your kiddo as much as possible, recognizing that, yeah, they might have a bad day. There also might be situations like colic and stuff that are more outliers. But if you can respond to them, show them that you are coming to them when they need, gradually they will ideally be able to calm themselves and get to rest when you need them to. Unfortunately, it's not like a perfect equation every time, but studies have shown that if kiddos are left to cry it out, it can actually lead to worse unhealthy attachment later on. Again, another myth with attachment is that if kiddos never want to leave their mom's side, that they are healthy with their attachment and that it just means that they love them and that they always want to be with them. Like we mentioned earlier, it is important that kids have the trust with their caregiver in order to be able to go explore when it's developmentally correct, especially when they're toddlers, and even 18 months, they're starting to get into that method of exploring their environment, but they have their caregiver as a home base to come back to all times. And so there's that balance between exploring and coming back. If a kiddo is constantly clingy, doesn't want to be away from caregiver side, it might be a sign that they don't have the trust there as much and might need to work on some of the attachment. Another myth is that only breastfeeding will lead to positive attachment, and that if you don't breastfeed or you breastfeed and use formula, that you're potentially gonna create an unhealthy attachment. And that, while we see that breastfeeding is a positive thing for attachment, skin to skin right from birth is definitely a positive thing for healthy attachment, it still doesn't mean you're doomed if a caregiver or mom isn't able to breastfeed or isn't able to breastfeed completely or even part of the time. Here at the center, we do recommend breastfeeding as much as possible because of certain nutrients that come from breastfeeding and positive outcomes. At the same time, that does not mean that attachment is going to be unhealthy just because someone can't or doesn't have the ability to. Lastly, as mentioned before, even if some unhealthy attachment comes out of earlier stages in life, it does not mean that a child is doomed to have negative or unhealthy attachments throughout their whole life. We're always constantly working on attachment in all of our relationships. And even the reverse, if someone has a really positive attachment as a child, there could be the possibility of having unhealthy attachments later on, so it's still always important to continually work on it. Lastly, it is important for caregivers in responding to their kiddos at a younger age especially, but even as they're growing older, to really focus on managing their own emotions in order to have the patience and the calm to deal with the situations that we know will come up with most children with tantrums and high emotions. This is one of the key things for growing a secure attachment with your kiddo. We're all human beings, and they are most likely going to model off how you manage your emotions in a situation. Then for some tips with growing attachment with your kiddo in small ways when they're younger, as well as growing older. 3 helpful things to do with babies include healthy touch and massage, mirroring, so if they do something, you do it back to them, or you do something and they do it back to them, so that you can really use that eye contact and focus, and it just really can grow your relationship. And then lastly, talking as much as you can, even if you're just describing what you're doing, can of course help with learning, as well as can help with the affection, connection, and attachment that you have. Lastly, some activities for older children can really be focused around using eye contact, also using that healthy touch. We've seen that doing hair care, like routines, can help with growing attachment with older children. Doing games like patty cake or even peekaboo with younger children can help with that eye contact and connection, and reading together and doing things that bring you closer in that way as well. So those are the tips and myths of attachment. Thank you all.